My Lord Bishops, Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this evening's seminar. I'm Jerry Carruthers. I'm convener of the Scottish Catholic Historical Association, and delighted that tonight's seminar is a joint production between the SCHA and the Scottish Catholic Heritage Collections Trust. Hopefully we might have some more joint activity in future. And we'll hear a wee bit more from the Scottish Catholic Heritage Collections Trust a little later on, especially with regard to Blair's Museum, which works very well with tonight's theme on Mary Queen of Scots. So just the other thing to say before I introduce our speaker tonight, you've got the instructions on the screen about microphones please being on mute. And if you could kindly hold questions till the end, and put those into the chat function at the end of the lecture. We'll try to get through as many of those questions as we can. So tonight's speaker, it's a great pleasure to introduce a colleague at the University of Glasgow. Dr. Stephen Reid is a senior lecturer in Scottish history at Glasgow, and Stephen researches all aspects of Reformation and Jacobean Scotland. He's published extensively on religious and intellectual culture in the period, and his most recent publication with David McComish is Corona Borealis, Scottish Neo-Latin Poets on King James VI and his reign, 1566 to 1603, a wonderful anthology that appeared last year, and it includes a long poem on Mary's abdication and James's coronation. Stephen is just finishing a monograph on the childhood and rise to power of James VI, in which Mary features prominently. And for the past 5 years, he's been co-leading a project with Andrew Beveridge of the Hunterian Museum, looking at Mary's cultural afterlife and memorialisation in Scottish heritage collections, which has been funded for the past 2 years by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And there's more information on that on their website, and we can put that up perhaps in a wee while. And I'm sure some of that ground that I mentioned tonight will feature in Stephen's talk. So without any further ado, Dr. Stephen Reid to tell us about the Mary Queen of Scots project. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Can I just check that everybody can hear me? First of all, can I get a wee thumbs up from everybody? Yep, I can see a lot of smiling, nodding faces. That's excellent. Good. Right, I'm just going to share my slides now with you. Okay, and you should all be able to see the slides coming through just now. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Yep, okie dokie. And I'll just set up my view. So that's great. Okay, so it's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm delighted that so many of you could make it, albeit virtually. It's a real pleasure to be here. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is Mary's afterlife, which is something that I've been involved in researching extensively over the past 5 years. Tonight, I'm going to focus particularly on Mary's Catholic afterlife. I thought that was appropriate given the audience and the organisations for which I'm speaking. And I'll go into a bit more about the aims and scope of the talk in just a moment. But I wanted to begin tonight by looking at the project background, tell you a bit about that, and then I'll go on to say a bit more about Mary herself. So the interest in Mary, as Jerry said, I've worked extensively on James VI, and he's always been my interest. And I'll start with a confession that I've never rated Mary as a politician or as a reigning queen. I always thought that her reign was relatively short and quite disastrous. But she has become a central part of the work that I've been doing on the early James VI. And whenever I've spoken about Mary and James at conferences, Mary's the one that everybody really gets interested in. And that was part of the reason that Andrew Beveridge and I founded this research project 5 years ago. Simply put, why Mary? What is the endless and enduring fascination with her? Why are people so intrigued by her? And the project started its life with this painting here that you can see on the slide, the Abdication of Mary Queen of Scots, which was produced by Gavin Hamilton in the 1760s. Anne first came to me in 2015 and it said that she would like to do a small one-room exhibition about this painting at the University of Glasgow, as we own it in the Hunterian collection. And at the same time, I had been working a little bit on Mary's presence in the university collections on a course that I teach on Renaissance Scotland. And I said, well, it'd be interesting to find out if we have more items relating to Mary in the collections. So we set about putting a group of honours students in my course on Renaissance Scotland to looking for items relating to Mary and to researching them and writing them up. And what we found was quite startling, that the collection of items at Glasgow relating to Mary were really quite extensive, certainly internationally leading, and they all had lots of interesting stories to tell about the way that Mary had been remembered and the way that her cultural afterlife had resonated down through the centuries. From there, we held a series of scoping workshops with a number of Glasgow academics to look in a bit more depth at what was in the collection. And then we also had then gone on to develop a larger collection. And we found that with, that's where the current phase of the research project came in. The project that we're running just now is funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It's been running since January 2019. It was supposed to finish this month, but has been extended due to COVID until August. And the key things that we've been interested in doing on that project are looking at Mary's afterlife in Scottish heritage collections. So we've been partnered up with about 40 academics and museum curators from around Scotland, ranging from the very large collections at places like the National Museums of Scotland and the National Galleries, down to smaller collections, particularly those that have been owned and run by the Scottish Association of Country House Archivists. And we've been asking them to develop censuses of the collections of Marian material that they have. They've been presenting them to the working group that's been connected together on the project, and academics comment on the objects in these collections. And the idea is that we find out more about the key objects in these collections, and the collections and their managers and their curators can do more with them. They learn more about the objects as well and their context, both in the broader sense of the Scottish collections around them, but also in the historical collection sense. So if a collection has, say, a crucifix, how that connects to other crucifixes in collections around Scotland, and what that broader story is about Mary. And the key things we're asking in the project are, why has that story changed over time, and how? So in any society, whether it's the Georgian society or the Victorian society or the modern society, stories about Mary are told, but the way they've changed over that period, whether they focus on Mary's gender, the way they focus on her religion, the way they focus on attitudes to the monarch, they've all changed. And so we're interested in as much of what changes in the telling of that story, in how it's told, and the objects and the literature and the images through which it's told. And again, a couple of the key sub-questions: why are people so perennially interested in objects relating to Mary, be it furniture, be it the places like Holyrood where she's supposed to, where she had her chambers, places like Craigmillar, for example. Why do these resonate with people so much? And is there such a thing as a true portrait of Mary? And a big part of my research on the project has been looking at iconography of Mary, because, as I'm sure most of you know, when you think of Mary in your head, you probably have a very clear image of her. But all the portraits of Mary differ very, very widely. When you look at two portraits of Mary, particularly as the centuries go by, they never look the same. But like Robert Burns, as Jerry knows, there's something about these portraits that ties them all together, so you can see all these different figures. And it's in relation to that I want to talk tonight, particularly how the aspects of Mary's strongly held Catholic faith echo through the ages, how that aspect of her reputation emerges immediately after her death, and how it echoes through the centuries. I'm also interested in whether or not she is perceived as a Catholic martyr, if so, when and where this happens. And I'm going to focus tonight mainly on the image and object aspects of that. The project's chiefly interested in material culture relating to Mary. So I'll look at contemporary portraits. I'm going to look at some later historical portrayals of her as well, just a representative sample. But I'm also going to focus on portrayal of Mary in personal relics and relics that are attributed to her, and also look at Mary very briefly in some modern media. As I say, I'm happy to take questions at the end. The only caveat I would say is that I can't really talk to any questions that might relate to personal family or genealogy. So if you think that you're related to Mary, I'm afraid I can't answer questions on that. I can answer questions on her direct family line, but not the extended one. And again, if you have objects relating to Mary and you're thinking about getting them appraised, if you're interested in talking about an object, I'd be happy to do so after the talk, but not during the questions relating to this specific talk. I would say all the object images tonight, they're sourced from all over the place. Some are from the project database, some are from the internet. They're all copyright their respective owners unless otherwise stated. And I'm very grateful to Blair's Museum for allowing me to use a number of the images that they've got. And again, they've got some really key items relating to Mary's Catholic afterlife. And if you're interested, I would say please look at the Blair's Museum site or contact the curators, Eleanor and Amy, on the curator@blairsmuseum.org.uk email address. Okay, so we'll continue on now and we'll go down through some of the images, and we're going to look firstly at contemporary and near contemporary portraits. Okay. Now, I probably don't need to tell a lot of you about who Mary was or about her afterlife, but I'm just going to give you a very quick pen sketch of who she was and how her reputation developed into the 17th century. So Mary, as we know, was born in 1542. She succeeded to the Scottish throne at just 6 days old after her father, James V, died. She was sent to France for her own protection in the late 1540s, where she was betrothed to be married to the Dauphin Francis, who became Francis II of France in 1559. She expected to live most of her, or if not all of her life, in France as the Queen of France and Scotland. And then, of course, the death of the young Francis II in 1560 put paid to that. When she came back to Scotland in 1561, but it was, of course, to a Scotland that had been transformed. During her absence, it had declared for the Protestant faith. It had passed a series of articles without royal assent at the Parliament that outlawed the Mass and any form of Catholic authority in Scotland, and it had adopted a Protestant confession of faith. She had also become culturally separate from Scotland as well. She had been raised in every conceivable way, linguistically, culturally, socially, to think of herself as French. Her first language, both written and spoken, was French, and she had really never really learnt much about English or Scots until she returned to Scotland. And she also had become a deeply committed Catholic during her time in France. That had never left her. So on her return to Scotland, that posed a significant cultural barrier for her as well. Now, on her return in 1561, broadly speaking, her early personal reign, which lasted for 6 years, went quite well. She had a policy of religious toleration that was quite pragmatic. And even when fellow Catholics tried to coerce her or to push her into taking more aggressive action against Protestants, she demurred, most famously resulting in military action against the Earl of Huntly at the Battle of Corricky for a number of misdemeanors caused by the family. So that in that aspect, her Catholicism was quite well managed by her in a Protestant Scotland. It's fair to say that the second half of her personal reign was less successful, and you can attribute this to her marriage to Henry Stuart Lord Darnley, who, while a good dynastic match for her, by marrying him, they had the strongest combined ties in terms of blood and lineage to the English throne after Elizabeth. But in all other respects, in terms of obtaining the consent and advice of the Scottish Parliament, in terms of obtaining Elizabeth's favour to undertake the marriage, and in terms of Darnley's own personal behaviour and characteristics, it was a bad match. Now, we all know how that story ends. It ends with high explosives in Edinburgh in February 1567, when Darnley is found strangled and partially clothed outside the house at Kirkerfield. The finger is, of course, pointed at the Earl Bothwell. He was a close ally in the closing years of her personal reign in Scotland. And he was the man that most people believed was responsible for the murder of Darnley. He had abducted her in April 1567, and then after a hasty marriage, the two are forced to surrender at the Battle of Carberry Hill, where Mary is then placed in captivity and forced to abdicate in favour of her son. Now, we know that she is held as a prisoner for 19 years in England. And again, I put these ideas out for why she's a failure. Is it because of her religion? Is it because she really is culturally French and comes back to Scotland and can't cross that cultural gap? Is it because she's a queen initially ruling alone in a very patriarchal Protestant Scotland? And no matter who she married, was that going to alienate somebody? Or, more controversially, was it because she is naturally inept? Was she just not suited to the idea of personal rule? So there are some ideas, just as a pen sketch for Mary. Now, after Mary's death, her son James VI succeeds to the English throne as James VI I, the first king of a united Great British Isles. The Stuart dynasty, despite several challenges and periods of removal from throne, succeed in the British Isles until the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And Mary's story takes a remarkable upswing. She goes from being a traitor to the English throne and a traitor to Elizabeth to being the matriarch of the Stuart dynasty. And James VI himself is particularly involved in recasting her history, both in printed text and in statuary form, to make that image fit. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey is placed along with the matriarchs who have helped founded and develop the rest of the English monarchical line. She's arguably got a slightly better position in Westminster Abbey than Elizabeth I does. And she's also used by both Republicans and Royalists in the propaganda wars that exist throughout the 17th century. She's taken, when people are advocating the removal of Charles I as an example of a fully healthy, mentally sound monarch in the prime of their life who is deposed for no other reason than being Catholic, and possibly because she's also a woman. And deposed unlawfully in favour of her son. On the other side, Republicans argue that she is, looking back in history, her behaviour, she's symbolic of the Guise family's attempt to control Scotland in French hegemony during the 1550s. She's an example of French tyranny taking control of Scotland, and that looking at Charles I, it's no surprise if we look back at his grandmother that we could see how that behaviour plays out, that it's part of the hereditary line. And I wish I had more time to talk about that tonight, but there's a lot of literature that you can look at this for textual afterlives of Mary. Okay, so moving forward now, Mary's image. I want to begin by looking at true images of Mary with this quote from Lionel Cust, who did an extensive workup over a century ago on all the authentic portraits of Mary. Now, he concluded that there were very few authentic portraits, but he did note, and I think this is very true, that few heroines of romance have been so idly regarded from the point of view of portraiture as Mary, Queen of Scots, most people being in the habit of choosing at their own pleasure that particular attributed likeness, which tallied most with their own preconceived idea. I really like the idea of that quote, because what he's saying is that both the artists who create these portraits and the viewers who look at them pour into them what they want to find of Mary, what they think about her, and what their expectations and hopes of her are. And I think this one here from a Falkirk chapbook in the Glasgow University collections really sums that up well. So chapbooks in the 18th century, as many of you know, kind of penny dreadful prints. They have, they're short, they give an accessible, entertaining story. They can be journalistic, they can be more literary in focus. And this one here is on the affecting and tragical history of Queen Mary of Scotland. Now, if you look closely at the portrait, you'll note that that is in no way a true or real portrait of Mary. But there's something about the way that the hair is carried, there's something about the way that the dress is carried that could make you resonate or make your mind resonate with Mary. And we see that when we look at a lot of portraits about Mary. They might not actually look like her, or as far as we know, authentically like her, but you know that you're looking at a portrait. And Catholic identity certainly appears in those too. So two of the handful of arguably authentic portraits of Mary can be seen here, and they're by the French court artist Francois Clouet, who put together an incredible series of pencil sketches and chalk sketches of the French royal family in the 1540s and 1550s. We have one here of Mary, certainly just at about 6 years old, 7 years old, in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and we have one of her en deuil blanc, wearing her white mourning veil, again, either to commemorate the death of her father-in-law, Henry II, or her husband, Francoise, or both, again, in her late teens at this point. Now, one is in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the other in the Royal Collection, and you'll note, looking at these portraits, that there are definite points of similarity. We can see the high forehead, which we know that Mary had. We can see the strong Stuart nose. We can see the softer chin, which again manifests quite clearly in later portraits of Mary. We can see the fullness of face in both, and we can see that there's a definite connection in the look between these two images. We can see the hazel eyes, and we can see the red hair. But if we take that as the archetype of Mary, fast forwarding, no portraits of Mary were undertaken during her personal reign in Scotland, and the next evidence that we have of images of Mary are the miniature that is done by Nicholas Hilliard around about 1578. Again, the most famous example in the Royal Collection. And here we can see there it's a slightly older Mary. We can see that it's similar to the images we've just looked at. We can see that the years of captivity have given way to a softer, more doughy face with a softer and jowlier chin, but the features are still broadly similar to the ones that we've just looked at in the previous image. We can also see that it's mirrored in the engraving here in John Leslie's De Origine Moribus et Rebus Gestis Scotorum Libri Decim, 10 books on the origin, the customs and the deeds of the Scots. And in this book, he has a picture of Mary, and it's linked to the picture of her son, and it's surrounded with all sorts of Latin emblems and iconography. You can see here that that portrait, possibly this Hilliard miniature, possibly another source, but you can definitely see the points of contact here. You can see that there's the cap and the veil, you can see the ruff as well, and you can see the striking similarity of face. Now, I want to spend a bit more time looking at this because it's arguable that even before Mary's death in this image, we're seeing the construction of a Catholic martyr's identity. Leslie, of course, was Mary's greatest apologist. He wrote several books defending the lawfulness of her succession to the throne of England, in fact, defending her right to the English throne above that of Elizabeth's. He also defended her as both a devout Catholic, as a woman of great moral scruple, and someone who was treated exceptionally unfairly and illegally by the Scottish Protestant lords. And that presentation appears in symbological terms in this engraving in the origin. We can see this little piece of Latin text down the side of the piece, and it says, Maria Regina Scotorum ordine regum civii, Mary Queen of Scots, 107th in the line of kings. So he's connecting her definitely to the line of authorised kings. By 1578, many other historians like George Buchanan were excluding her. And he notes here in this little piece of Latin text, Mary, at 7 days old, succeeded her father in the kingdom, which from then to the 20th year of her age, the acts of which period are contained in the following history, was administered by regents, vacant for a brief interim, either by foreign or civil war. Truly, the Queen has always displayed the utmost and a clearly admirable strength of mind in the most difficult of circumstances, as can be seen in the history of John Leslie, Bishop of Ross. So immediately in this small piece of text, you're getting a sense of Mary as someone who is facing hardship, as a martyr does, someone who, for their own faith and goodness, is being beset on all sides by political forces they cannot control, and someone who's been dealt great hardship in life. Now you'll note below the image here on the screen that it says optimum partem elegit. And I was surprised to find when I was doing research for this that no one had really looked into this in any great depth. But it's an important construction of the idea of Catholic martyrdom on Leslie's part. And it relates back to the story of Mary and Martha in Luke 10:38-42. And it says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. He had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things. Only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." So on one level here, Leslie is drawing attention to the fact that Mary has chosen to focus on a life of piety, of defense of her own Catholic faith, and to defend that faith while she is in captivity, and under the control of another monarch illegally. But he's also seeing here in the reference, "it will not be taken away from her," that the Scottish throne is still hers. The right to the throne of England is still hers, and they will not be given up. So he's combining here both a political message and one that references her Catholic beliefs and the presentation of her as someone suffering for her faith. That image is also continued in the presentation of James VI, whose own image in that frontis, in that engraving, is also surrounded by symbology. For James, it says a quote from Proverbs 22:28, "Son, do not surpass the ancient boundaries which your fathers have set. Do not, in other words, accept the illegal elevation of yourself to the throne." And James himself was just beginning to come technically of age from a legal standpoint in 1578. So this is Leslie reminding him, do not agree to accept this. Restore your mother to the throne. And we see that in one of the other ribbons around his image, Mater Carissima Dulce Me. Dearest mother, teach and lead me, guide me. In other words, not trying to ignore his mother as a ruler. And if he does, then again, we have this other quote in another ribbon going down the side. "Arise, boy, you will surpass the others. You will surpass your ancestors. Great boy, deeds celebrated with your titles." But as the small piece of text here, this small couplet at the bottom says, "He will only do so if he is a lover of maternal piety." His mother has given birth to a son who is a king of exceeding character and hope, i.e. hope that he will inherit the British Isles. But he will only be a truly fortunate king, 3 and 4 times more fortunate, if he follows that advice and signs up to devotion to his mother. One other point that always cracks me up about this image, you'll see around the image, you'll note it says princeps very clearly. That was a sore point. James did not like being called princeps by his mother. He wanted to be called Rex. But here they're saying very clearly he is the Prince of Scotland, not the king, though he is already crowned. And it says here, in the years of his age, annuitatis 12. Does that look like a 12-year-old boy to you? I don't think so. He looks about 5, maybe 6. And again, that's a conscious manipulation of his image to make him look young, to make him look inexperienced against his older and wiser and graver mother. Catholicism also plays a part in the only double portrait that we have of Mary and her son James. And we see it here in the Blair Castle double portrait in Blair Castle in Perthshire. And I've put that against the Hardwick Hall portrait of Mary in Darnley for reference. Now, the double portrait of Mary and James is also important in Mary's Catholic afterlife because it is commissioned to commemorate the discussions of association between Mary and James. The idea that Mary would return to Scotland as a joint ruler on the throne with James in return for recognising his right to rule. This negotiation went on between 1579 and 1583. It was reaching its apogee in that period, just at the time that the painting was created. And again, we see a little hint of Catholic symbolism here. There's the shared crown between the two, but you can also see Mary touching what would normally be a crucifix in her portraits. It kind of looks a bit like a crucifix, but here it appears to just be an amulet or something similar. But you can see that the coded symbology is drawing attention to the jewels that she normally wears. In terms of the joint rule, Mary was much more invested in this than James was. He was deeply uncommitted to his mother by this point, emotionally vacant from her. And sadly, he only really wanted to string her along in this in the hopes that he could get his mother to legitimate him in the eyes of the Catholic monarchy in Europe. But Mary put much more emotion into it and was really devastated when the association fell apart. She felt extremely betrayed. But it's nice to see a symbolic image of that, all centered on James's recognition by the Catholic heads of states of Europe, and the restoration of Mary. Now, I said already that true portraits of Mary are few and far between, and here's where we launch off into Mary as a martyr. And there are three broad typologies that I'd like to draw to your attention. It's important to note that immediately after Mary's death in 1587 and right through the 17th century, in continental Europe, there was an explosion in martyrdom literature surrounding Mary. There were plays and tragedies and novelizations of Mary's story put on everywhere from Italy through to Portugal and in between. It was a staple of French drama right through the 17th century. And there's an excellent article by Stefano Vitelli on this afterlife of Mary in textual terms. But of course, another part of Catholic literature in this period, and a key part of the arguable victories that were made by the Counter-Reformation in the late 16th century, were engravings, engravings and woodcuts, because they could respond and convey a didactic message very clearly and very easily without the need for the advanced literacy that we found in the Protestant faith. They could be reproduced as a single broadsheet or as part of a book, and they could be added to, tinkered with, changed very simply by changing the setup on the press to develop these. And what we find is that authors across Europe take advantage of this technology to disseminate images of Mary, and they have a range of features. The first is the standard portrait of Mary, and that can be a very sketchy portrait. As you can see here, it could be Mary. We have the cap in the ruff, and we have the bodice, but this doesn't really look anything like true portraits of Mary. But you see that the image here has Mary in the middle. There's a range of iconography and features that can be added to them. The one from Adam Blackwood's book is very plain. The one by Thomas de Leeuw has a Latin tableau at the bottom and a range of heraldic shields, angels, and other iconography around them. And this image was replicated again and again through both the 17th and the 18th century with varying symbology, which I'll come on to in a moment. So that's the first typology of the martyrdom portrait for Mary. The second is, of course, the Sheffield portrait type. Now, you're probably looking at this now thinking, yup, that's the Mary that I know. That's the authentic Mary that I know. And we've got three different examples here. We've got the Morton or Dalmahoy portrait in the middle, which was originally in the collection of the Earls of Morton, supposedly from 1585, and it was the Earls of Morton from whom John Burrell purchased it, now in the Glasgow Life collection. We've got NPG 429, which was once in the Royal Collection, possibly based on an image from Mary's life. It's certainly a very realistic image. And again, the Latin inscription records that she'd been a prisoner for 10 years. I'll come back to some of the symbology in this picture in just a second. And of course, we've got the Blair's Museum portrait as well, which has a parallel in the Royal Collection in Holyrood. It's in Mary's Chambers in Holyrood House. And it shows the culmination of the iconic portrait development process. Now, in all the Sheffield portrait types, what we find is usually a full-length Mary in black dress. We find the iconic accessories of the cap, the ruff, the crucifix usually, and we find varying other elements. But in the most advanced and evolved iconographic versions of these portraits, the Blair's and the Royal Collection portrait, we find much more detail. So let's have a look at this a bit more closely. Now, it was believed that the Blair's Memorial was commissioned around about 1600 or on the decades either side by Elizabeth Curll, one of Mary's handmaids at her execution. And in the background of the picture there, just at the bottom, you can see Jane Kennedy or Joan Kennedy and Elizabeth Curll, her handmaidens, as part of the picture. The Blair's Memorial is didactic on several levels, as is the collection, as is the copy in the Royal Collection, far more than the other Sheffield portrait types. It includes a range of text, so three different elements of text panels, which you can see in a bit more detail in the picture here. One at the top, giving a brief biography of Mary and the suffering that she's handled in her life. one in the middle, which accounts for her execution at Fotheringhay, at the court of Fotheringhay, again with a verse tableau, and then one at the bottom, which speaks to the peace that she finds in the afterlife and the fact that she was and always is a daughter of the true Catholic faith, a daughter of the Roman Church, and someone who always stood up for her beliefs. The distinction between the Royal Collection version and the Blair's collection is this addition of prima quod vixit col Scot parens et fund, the first parent and founder of the Scots College. Now, while the Blair's portrait was in the collection at Douai, I think this is a reference to the fact that Mary had given money while in prison via James Beaton, the Archbishop, to assist and found the Scots College at Paris. So again, seen as a patron and founder of the Scots College and the training of Scottish Catholic priests abroad. The image also includes Mary's heraldic armorial to emphasise her royal nature, to emphasise her dignity, and the fact that she's an anointed queen who's been executed. Blair's doesn't feature an important element that's present in some of the other examples. Here we have Mary sporting two crucifixes, one in hand, one round her chest, and she has her prayer book. But if we look at the previous one, if we look at the NPG example, she has a second crucifix that when we zoom in really closely has an image of Susanna and the elders. Susanna, of course, falsely accused in the book of Daniel for adultery. She perseveres in her faith and in her belief that she is not guilty. And ultimately, it's her accusers who pay the price and are executed. So again, a very clear coded symbological message. So it's amazing how the iconography in the portrait can be adapted to show Mary in a range of different ways, but all relating to her Catholic martyrdom. Now, coming back to the range of engravings that appeared in the 17th and 18th century, I showed you a sketchy portrait of Mary that we just had a look at there, but it could also be an elaborate and quite graphic engraving of her execution. And here we see that these images could be heavily recycled, as in Adam Blackwood's History of the Martyrdom of the Queen of Scotland, with a small book of her death, Paris 1589. And again, it's just been flipped and engraved in a slightly finer way in Richard Verstegen's account of the cruelties of the heretics of our times, which is a book about English martyrdoms. Same image flipped, but in Verstegen's text, again, there's been a small commemorative Latin text added to it, saying that they're talking about Mary's suffering and the greater life that she goes on to. That iconography continued right through the 17th and 18th century before it gave way to what I'd call a more secular engraving culture around Mary. And when I was talking about tinkering a moment ago, you can see that here. In the one by Jan Wierix, we've got angels crowning Mary, and you'll see at her feet, she's got the four crowns of France, England, Ireland, and Scotland at her feet, surrounded by her heraldic arms. My favourite brand of these iconographic portraits, though, and the ones that again evoke martyrdom most strongly for me, are the ones when she's seen holding her own axe. Here we have her with a crucifix in one hand and her executioner's axe in the other, and four crowns above her head. We see it as well in the 18th century prints. Here, an example held in the Hunterian from 1735. There's a skeleton creeping up over her shoulder in the back of the picture, and you've got this floral axe arrangement beneath her and the full regalia of her crucifixes around her body. By the end of the 18th century, though, you can see that cult of martyrdom is beginning to diminish, and engravings are beginning to have less of the devotional feature. You can see it here in this example from the Glasgow Life collection in Provin's Lordship, where she's possibly with a maid at court in England, possibly meant to be James, we don't know. But you can see that a lot of the iconography, particularly the Catholic iconography, has been removed, and that trend would continue from the late 18th century onwards. Okay, this chat has gone silent, so I'm assuming that things are a bit better in terms of the screen front, and I'm hoping that you're all managing to follow along. I can normally see people on the video screen in the corner. I can't just now, so I'm just hoping that I'm still not speaking to empty space at the moment. A core part of being a martyr, of course, are the relics that you leave behind, usually imbued with a miraculous power, able to heal the sick, restore the blind, or to do some other kind of miraculous nature. Now, looking at Mary, as far as I'm aware, there are no miraculous relics connected to her, but there are certainly a cult of relics that develops around Mary very quickly after her death. But it's one that continues right down to the modern day. I want to begin by looking at personal relics, and we have here a couple of that start with the physical. So Mary's boxes of hair, and there are several boxes of hair that are still extant. We've got one that is in the royal collection here, and we've got one that was kept in a casket designed for them in the 19th century by either David Simpson or Daniel Sutherland, Lanarkshire silversmiths. And it says on the top of it, "Sacred to the memory of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots." Now, the lock of hair that was in the royal collection was bequeathed to Queen Victoria by Robert, the 8th Baron Belhaven and Stenton in 1868. Belhaven was distantly related to Mary, as was Victoria, so it was seen as an appropriate gift. And the hair is actually pure white, so I don't know why there is this direct connection to Mary. The hair was actually split into two portions, one kept with Victoria, the other given to Lord Belhaven's family, and it was sold in 2008 when it was alleged that it originally came with Mary's signature and a note super conveniently saying, "A lock of my own hair." It was expected to sell for £3,000. I don't know what it actually reached. Another example of Marian relics is beds, although in both cases, the association of the beds is tenuous at best and fictitious at worst. The bed that's the golden bed with the cradle, is Terrigal's bed at Traquair House. Now, Mary stayed at Traquair in 1566 on a holiday after giving birth to James. And the bed and cradle beside it are described as Mary's bed in Traquair literature. But elsewhere on the Traquair site, it's made clear that the bed actually came from Terrigal's house, the site of the Maxwells, destroyed in the First World War, and that parts of it date from the 16th century. Mary did stay at Terrigal's house, and it's believed that this is possibly the bed that she stayed on, but it's not the one that she stayed on in Traquair. And the cradle of James, again, I've never come across any evidence that James actually did stay at Traquair. So anybody who knows otherwise, I'd be grateful to hear that. The red bed that you can see here is the bed from Holyrood, and it's got a very famous story. This is a picture of it in 1861. In Holyrood, the James V Tower and the apartments there were all inhabited by the Duke of Hamilton in the 17th century as keeper of the palace with his family. His daughter Anne probably commissioned the red bed that you can see for her room in the 1670s, and it's first found in inventories of the palace in 1684. The bed was moved up to Mary's chambers in 1761 when a replacement was ordered for the Hamilton chambers, but by 1784, this bed, along with other furniture in the room, was being described as Mary's. And this cult of Mary was exacerbated by the housekeeper, who took the guided tours around the rooms and swore that all of these items had been in the room since Mary's time. Various artists and authors, including Walter Scott, were entranced by this couch of the Rose of Scotland, as it was called, and it was still being presented as Mary's in the 1920s until the 1970s, when it was replaced in the contemporary chambers outside of Mary's apartment, and it was the full story was put back in place again. So again, a relic imbued with power by the viewer, but not really a Marian relic. I've already talked about Mary and her self-fashioning as a Catholic martyr, and I would say that another key example of this is Mary's embroideries. We have a quote here from Nicholas White talking about how Mary enjoyed embroidering. It helped her pass the time in captivity. And she did a lot of this with Elizabeth Talbot, or Bess of Hardwicke, the Countess of Shrewsbury and wife of Mary's keeper for most of her time in England. Now, they produced a whole range of embroidery panels, most of which are kept by the Victoria and Albert Museum. And again, they often have lovely coded messages. In the top, you can see a cat produced by Mary, and you might think, well, so what? It's a cat, until you look at the colour of the cat. It is ginger, and you realise that the mouse on the floor is supposed to be Mary, And the cat itself, with its ruff of hair, bears more than a passing resemblance to Elizabeth. And you can see Mary's cipher just to the right of the whiskers of the cat. We also see Mary's use of symbology and text relating to martyrdom in these other two panels. The mottos there, Virescit vulnere virtus, virtue grows by wounding, and Las penas pasan y queda la esperanza, sorrows pass but hope survives. And in both images, she embroiders into these the symbol of the marigold, her own personal symbol, because it always looks to the sun. The idea that even in shadow, she looks towards the sun and the hope of a better day. Another key Marian relic is, of course, the Blair's reliquary, which uses the portraiture of Mary in a very, very different way. Again, possibly owned by Elizabeth Curll, gifted in her will to the Scots College at Douai in 1620. It's been argued by a couple of authors that the portrait here is yet another example of an authentic late portrait of Mary. The detail in it's slightly different from the Hilliard miniature, possibly as late as 1583 to 1586. But here we have the use of the portrait in an actual reliquary itself, a gold and silver reliquary. It's supposed to contain the relics of a sequence of English Jesuit martyrs, including Campion, Edmund Campion, Henry Walpole, and Thomas Garnet. It says specifically MRA, Maria Regina Angliae, Mary Queen of England, and it had belonged to Lady Milford, as reported by Mary Monica Maxwell Scott in her novel, The Tragedy of Fotheringhay. And Andrew Lang again thought this was possibly a contemporary portrait. So again, a clear Catholic relic of Mary here. Other Marian relics with a question mark. There are many crucifixes associated with Mary, and these are just a sample of them. One from Limerick, one from the National Museum of Scotland, one from Abbotsford. And one of the curators associated with our project has thoroughly debunked the one at Abbotsford, reckons it's 18th century and probably made in Jerusalem. And there are many other examples of crucifixes that I could have put up that are always said to have belonged to Mary, but there's very little evidence for that beyond them. Death masks as well. Now, you might think that as a Marian relic in Mary's Catholic afterlife, death masks would be straightforward. They're really not. We have a representative sample here. There are many, many more that I could have shown. We've got the cast of Mary's tomb, which is in Westminster Abbey, but this is a cast of the head held by Traquair. We've got a waxen death mask, unadorned, from the Lennox Love collection, again, distant relatives of Mary's family. We've got a painted and bewigged version of a death mask that's on display in Jedburgh House. We've also got Mary's head literally stuck to the ceiling at Abbotsford as well, in wood. Now, again, looking at these, they're as complex as the portrait. None of them look similar. You know, with the exception of the one from Lennox Love, that you're looking at Mary because of the hair, the way it's positioned, and the cap. But if we were to run a facial analysis on these, try and map down face patterns, you would find they differ exceptionally and that they're very, very different. So when are they real? I don't know. Anna Groundwater pointed out to me that all relics of Mary's were burnt straight after her execution to ensure that they couldn't be replicated. So I'm not sure how you would have got a face mask in time, although of course her body was sealed in lead. Now I'm conscious we're just about at time, so I'm going to skip over later historical paintings of Mary, except to say that you can see in these portraits that you still get a remnant of the Catholic iconography, not in the abdication of Mary Queen of Scots, where it's a much more Greco-Roman picture. You see a little bit of it in Robert Herdman's painting of Queen Mary and John Knox meeting here. You can see that there is a crucifix just in her hand. In this picture of Chatelard, the poet playing the lute to Mary, again, she's in full Catholic iconography. This is based on another engraving in a book of supposed sonnets written by Chatelard to Mary that came out in the late 18th century. Again, full Catholic regalia here. I like this picture by David Opie because it shows Mary suffering very viscerally. Here she's being held as Rizzio is murdered in front of her very eyes. And again, we see Fodden Side holding her by the waist, the pregnant waist. And again, Mary as a temptress here, escaping from Lochleven in William Craig Sheriff's portrait, holding again with the crucifix around her. So these icons of Mary's afterlife resonate very, very strongly. Just to finish, one thing I wanted to point out in terms of Mary's Catholic afterlife, after the Jacobite period, the sense of Mary's connectedness to Catholicism drops quite significantly in the British Isles. It's still very present in the European textual afterlife of Mary, not so much in the British one. But one place where we always find Mary's Catholic afterlife emerging is in modern media. And I give you here a selection of images, some culled from the database, some culled from an excellent blog called Red or Dead, Mary as a Catholic Martyr. The one image that everybody always brings in films is Mary at her execution as a Catholic martyr. And we've got Vanessa Redgrave here, we've got Samantha Morton, Saoirse Ronan, and my favourite, Barbara Flynn. There are many TV adaptations of Mary's martyrdom, but if you've not seen the Channel 4 production of Elizabeth I from 2005, I really recommend it. It's the execution that is based on Robert Wingfield's account, and it really does bring to life the visceral nature of Mary's execution. It has all the little details in there about what happens to her after her death. But that's, out of all the legacies of Mary's afterlife, that's the one that remains most strong in the public mind. I'll skip over these. Just to quickly conclude then, the image of Mary as a Catholic martyr peaked in early modern Europe, although her textual afterlife as a Catholic martyr continued in Europe far more than it did in the British Isles. The strongest way that that has been remembered is, of course, her iconic look, and particularly her crucifix, the martyr's bodice, and the iconography around her and her death. Marian relics, though, physical objects associated with her, have a very confused and conflicted life of their own. It's extremely hard to disseminate what's real and what's not. And often it's more important to think about the stories that have been told about them and the need that people have to connect with them, rather than trying to figure out if they are true Marian relics. And if you'd like to find out more, please look at our project site and also look at the resources that are up on screen. Okay, I'll stop sharing the slides now and then we can turn over to questions. Thank you for your time.